All good here. All right, so we are live right now, and just gonna take a moment to mute us on our other screen here, and we'll give folks a minute to join in. Looks like we have about 40 some people already in the waiting room for our talk, so really excited for everyone who's joined in today. I guess it's this afternoon. So yeah, I guess I'll do an official welcome because my phone just told me it's 12:30. So welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for day one of Wisconsin Salt Awareness Week. I'm Allison Madison with Wisconsin Saltwise. The Wisconsin Saltwise Partnership works hard to provide a variety of training resources and opportunities for facilities managers, private contractors, municipal plow operators, and pretty much everyone in between on best practices regarding winter maintenance. But this week, Wisconsin Salt Awareness Week is focused on bringing greater awareness of the problems around salt pollution to the public eye. So to kick the week off, we have Bayley Wilmoth from the University of Toledo and Katie Cassidy from the University of Minnesota, Duluth. During their presentations, you can type any questions or comments that you may have into the chat, and then we'll take those questions at the end. So thanks again for joining us, and without further ado, I will turn it over to Bayley.
Hi, thank you very much, Allison. I am going to share my screen really fast. Thank you all for coming, and then we will get started. Okay. Share this and get us in presentation mode. All right. Hi, like Allison said, my name is Bayley Wilmoth. Thank you again for having me. I am a current PhD student at the University of Toledo. I work with Dr. William Hentz out of the Department of Environmental Sciences and the Lake Erie Center. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the economic and environmental toll of road salts. So first, just a little bit of background information. In the United States, regions that get snow and ice during inclement winter weather events contain more than 70% of the roads and almost 70% of the U.S. population, according to the U.S. Federal Highway Administration in 2017. The image in front of you is a representation of snow accumulation across the country, and is also a representation of potentially vicinities that would need to more frequently apply road salts. And so what are road salts? Well, road salts are most commonly sodium chloride. There are many alternatives to sodium chloride, such as calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, and others that Katie will talk to you a little bit about later. The three most commonly used road salts in the United States, as well as across the globe, are sodium chloride, magnesium chloride, and calcium chloride. And road salts are used in order to maintain safe driving conditions during those inclement weather events that we discussed on the second slide. Now, road salts can reduce accident rates by 87 and 78% on average for two-lane and multi-lane highways, meaning that they're an effective way for your winter commute to stay safer than the alternative of not using road salts, as well as maintaining important economic things such as the trucking industry for transportation of goods. So what does it cost us to use road salts and to maintain that level of safety, as well as that maintenance of important businesses? Well, in terms of actual costs, externalized costs for road salts have been estimated somewhere between $1,300 and $3,000 per ton of road salt that is applied, and with an estimated upwards of 15 million tons of road salts applied each year by transportation agencies, there's an extrapolated cost of somewhere between $19.8 and $45 billion each year spent for road salts. In terms of your own personalized costs, potentially, if you own a car, economic costs for your car were surveyed in 2017 to be somewhere around $15.4 billion over a 5-year span, in the 5 years prior to 2017, which is roughly $3 billion each year. And road salts also provide a threat to forms of infrastructure, including roads or bridges. Road salt application increases the frequency of freeze and thaw cycles, which can lead to the production of cracks and potholes within roads, as well as the corrosion of infrastructure like bridges. Road salts can corrode away things like concrete by leaching out calcium and corroding into the steel that exists within things like bridges, and that overall reduces the lifespan of those infrastructures. Other infrastructures that could be potentially influenced by road salt application include water infrastructure such as plumbing. One example of this was found in southern New York when greater than 50% of the wells used for drinking water surpassed EPA guidelines of 250 milligrams per liter chloride. And the respective cost to fix this problem for just 2 towns was $4.7 million for a town containing 20 homes and $13.2 million for a town containing 500 homes. And so we've talked a little bit about what road salts are and what they're used for, and the potential cost that they might have to our roadways, our infrastructures, and even our property, such as our vehicles. But what about the ecological costs? Well, this has been a discussion of the scientific community for quite some time, roughly 20 years, and in recent years, this has broken more into common news outlets, with this bottom left-hand headline being from just 2 weeks ago in the New York Times. So why are people talking about why road salts work, but also why they're bad for the environment? This starts with a discussion of the global water supply and fresh waters and why fresh waters are so important. The global water supply contains approximately 97% of the global water supply is salt water, meaning that only about 3% of that water supply is fresh water. Of that 3%, about 2% is frozen water, and about 1% is ground or surface water. And fresh waters are so important because when we talk about that 1% that is ground and surface water, we're talking about things like habitats such as wetlands, lakes, rivers, streams. We're also talking about things like groundwater and aquifers and other things that we can access for drinking water. And so in terms of that, what do freshwaters provide? Well, freshwaters can provide important things like nutrient cycling, which is necessary to maintain things like water quality and water clarity. They also provide habitats for wildlife, as well as recreation for humans and drinking water, as previously mentioned. The image right here on the right is of the Great Lakes, which is approximately 21% of the fresh water that is on the surface of the earth. And this is a really big deal whenever we talk about how much fresh water we can use, because these Great Lakes by themselves provide drinking water to roughly 40 million people in the US and Canada. And so when we're talking about what freshwaters provide, and we're talking about road salts, we also would like to know how road salts threaten what these freshwaters are providing, right? Well, in terms of nutrient cycling, road salts can alter things like the nitrogen and phosphorus cycle, which are important, again, to maintaining water quality and water clarity, and as well as ecosystem function. When we're talking about how road salts also can impact habitat for wildlife and have direct effects to wildlife, they can impact habitat by altering water chemistry or those nutrient cycles like we discussed, but they also have direct effects to wildlife. One of those can be seen here in this image on the right, which is representative of a direct effect to rainbow trout, which after 25 days showed a reduction in growth, as you can see on this very far right image, which is a substantial thing whenever we talk about other things like recreation, because humans like to fish for rainbow trout. They are a major sport fish. And so we are talking about potential reductions in that recreation. In the Great Lakes that you saw on the previous slide, they provide roughly 52 billion a year economically in recreational services from things like hunting and fishing. We're also talking about drinking water. And whenever we alter things like nutrient cycling or water chemistry, or even how habitats are altered by road salts or how animals use them, we are altering how our water supply is being used and maintained. And that is a potentially very large threat if we're talking about damaging our drinking water supply. So in summary, road salts are critical for transportation during winter weather conditions, as they can reduce accident rates. They also are damaging to things like infrastructure and habitats, and have the ability to alter ecosystem functions through things like nutrient cycling and how animals can interact with their environments. They also threaten drinking water supplies. And when we are using road salt, we must be salt wise because of all of these things that are being threatened. And so you might be asking at this point, what can we do to reduce the effects of road salt? Well, there are alternatives to road salt, as we discussed in the beginning of the presentation, that Katie will tell you about more about in just a second. But there are also things like best management practices that we can implement as well. And best management practices can be anything from covering our salt storage to calibrating equipment whenever we are to calibrating equipment to things like preventing over application of road salts. We can also vary our application rates based on precision weather forecasts when we know we're going to get big storms and things like that. We can use pre-wetting materials to apply liquids before storms, which can allow for a reduction in the amount of road salt that needs to be applied by allowing for the salts that are applied to stick a little better to the roads. We can use things like live edge snow plows to remove more snow. We can evaluate our performance after each of these storms, and we can evaluate our expectations of levels of service as citizens and as drivers. And so we can manage when we go get our groceries or run our errands and those kinds of things. With that being said, I'm going to kind of transition into Katie talking to you about these alternatives. And thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Bailey. I'm going to take over now in the direction of alternative deicers. So my name is Katie. I am a graduate student in the Water Resources Science Department at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. And I'm excited to talk to you a bit about alternative deicers. So what kind of alternatives do we have? There are some different categories here. We have agricultural deicers. So we're thinking about more creative options. We've used molasses, corn products, beet juice, cane syrup, stuff like that. Acetates are fairly common for alternatives. So that's calcium, magnesium acetate, potassium acetate, and sodium acetate. And then glycol and formates have been used primarily in airports for airplane de-icing. And so when we're thinking about alternatives to chloride, so we know now, as Bailey said, there's been decades of research. There's a lot of environmental issues with applying chlorides. The biggest issue being it just doesn't degrade. So we're seeing this increase in chloride concentration over time. It's building up in the environment, and we're finding that we're seeing increased freshwater salinization. So when we're thinking about alternatives, we're looking for things that are biodegradable. But we have a big question mark next to the environmental impact of these alternatives. So there's been an increased interest in research in the past few years on the environmental impact of alternatives, because we don't want to trade sodium chloride deicer for something that is different but has other negative impacts. So really trying to be very careful with the environmental impact of applying alternative deicers. So what do we think about when we're thinking about environmental impact? Well, we want to know if it's going to be toxic to either roadside vegetation from the spray of the deicer, but also to aquatic life, because that's where the deicer eventually ends up, is in our water resources. We want to know its fate in the environment. Where is it going to go? Is it going to degrade? How quickly is it going to degrade? And then we want to know the environmental impact of that biodegradation, which is potentially oxygen depletion. So when we apply organic deicers, they are great food for microorganisms in the environment and in the water. And so that's how these deicers degrade, is we have microbes that eat them up, but in the process, they are consuming oxygen while they do that. So a big environmental concern with alternative deicers is oxygen depletion, especially in freshwater systems. So we want to make sure that we won't be depleting oxygen in our water bodies. So I'm going to dive into a bit of a case study here on one specific alternative, which is potassium acetate. So potassium acetate is a liquid 50% potassium acetate solution. It is organic, which means it's biodegradable. It is effective at lower temperatures and less corrosive than sodium chloride. So this all sounds great, but we want to know the environmental impact. So I've been doing some research on an environmental study on potassium acetate the past few years in Duluth, Minnesota, because the Minnesota Department of Transportation applied this alternative deicer on a few roads. And so we were able to do an environmental field evaluation in which we collected stormwater from these roads where potassium acetate was applied. And then we also collected lake water where the stormwater was entering the downstream water body. And so we want to know, what is the concentration? Just generally, what are we finding in the field? What's the impact of this deicer? And then how does it degrade, and what are the environmental impacts? Is it going to be toxic to aquatic life or plants? So when we're thinking about this biodegradation problem, like I said, it's only an issue with organic deicers because microbes are eating them and then depleting oxygen while they're consuming and breaking down that alternative deicer. And so this has been probably the biggest environmental question when we're thinking about alternatives in research. And so actually one popular alternative is urea. And that has kind of fallen out of use in the past few years because we did find through this research that urea has a very high oxygen demand. And so the water quality impacts were too high to really keep considering as an alternative deicer. And then another alternative deicer is calcium magnesium acetate. And there was a study done a while back that found that that also has a pretty significant oxygen demand. And so, like I've been emphasizing, this research is very broad into these alternatives, and it's really new. So we really have a lot of big questions. And so we're just sort of entering this field of knowledge, trying to understand, will we see oxygen depletion with these different deicers? And there has not really been research done specifically on potassium acetate. So in our field study, we looked at oxygen depletion, and we found that, well, the deicer is organic, so it does have a really high oxygen demand. That demand doesn't actually result in low dissolved oxygen. If you look at this figure here, this is showing our results from measuring dissolved oxygen. In the blue is our lake. So that's really what we care about, is our freshwater oxygen. And you can see that at no point in our sampling did we find low dissolved oxygen. So this is good news for applying this deicer up here in Duluth. And so, like I said, the other issue we want to think about when we're thinking about alternative deicers is toxicity. We don't want to apply something that's going to kill all of our roadside grasses or affect aquatic life. So we were specifically looking at seed germination and impacts to the deicer there. And we found that the acetate is responsible for the toxicity in this deicer, but germination really won't be impacted at the concentrations that we're going to find in roadside soils. When we think about the aquatic toxicity, we looked at a specific organism, the water flea, or Daphnia, which is fairly common when we're thinking about toxicity studies. And here we found potassium is responsible for the toxicity. And these organisms were actually affected at a fairly low concentration, which is a concentration that could be reached in our freshwater water bodies from the application of this deicer. And so when we're thinking about the use of potassium acetate, we'll want to think about, where is this being applied and what water body is the stormwater draining into. Because if it's a smaller water body, if there's less dilution, if there's less mixing, we'd be more likely to surpass this aquatic toxicity value that we found. And so really what I just want to emphasize is the title of this presentation, the environmental toll. We know there's been so much research on the environmental impact of chlorides. It is clear and it is urgent that we need to reduce the use of these as quickly as possible. And so there's been broad research into alternatives to chloride. And so when we're doing, thinking about alternatives, we're thinking about the cost, the corrosion, and the environmental impact. And so what's going to happen in the environment? Will it be toxic, and how does it degrade? And we have many, many more questions. And so this research that we've been looking into on potassium acetate is kind of the first research into the specific environmental impacts of this deicer. And keep an eye out in the coming years for research in more on this deicer, but also more on other deicers, because we have a lot more questions on what is going on in the environment and how can we best reduce the application of chlorides. So I think we will hear from Allison for any questions from the chat now.
All right. Thank you so much, Katie and Bailey. Excellent presentations. Really appreciate your time today and all the work that's gone into this. We do have a question that's popped up in the chat here from Wilfred Nixon. Looks like this one is directed, Katie, towards you. The question is, what application rates of potassium acetate were used? And also, what was the cost per gallon, if you know that information?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure on that. I would have to look up the values for the application rate. So if you're interested, you can email me and I can definitely get back to you with that. And what was the other half of the question? Oh, the cost. So the cost of potassium acetate it used to be really expensive. It used to be like 30 times more expensive than sodium chloride, and it's dropped now. And I want to say it's about 7 times more expensive. I don't remember the exact value of that, but I know MnDOT has found it to be about 7 times more costly than sodium chloride. So definitely more expensive upfront, but then we're potentially avoiding the later on costs of environmental issues that end up costing money from chloride application.
All right. Thank you, Katie. So I have a question, Bailey, for you. And again, I don't know if this is something that you'll be able to answer right now, but I was really intrigued by the data from, you said Southern New York State. It looked like there were a couple different communities that had wells that had been polluted with road salts, and they needed to do some sort of mitigation. And you quoted like the cost of, kind of working on those wells. Do you know anything more about those communities and kind of what they did to try to work on the problem there of salty drinking water?
Well, I can actually send you a couple of resources if you want them specifically, including where I pulled those numbers from. But really, I had used, I'm sorry, will you say the first part of that again?
Just, I guess I'm curious about any more information that you can share about those communities, kind of, where they were, what was going on, what they did.
There is actually a decent number of papers posted about Southern New York in terms of their wells. I don't know exactly their mitigation strategy, if that's what you're asking for, in terms of repairing those wells or kind of reducing or replacement. I'm not sure about their true mitigation status or plan. But I do have the information in terms of where those were in specific towns and things. If you would like me to send you that, I can do that.
Yeah, no, definitely. That would be great. Thanks, Bailey.
Yeah.
All right, looks like we've got another question coming in here, actually a couple more. So the first one is from Drew, and his question is, what do we know about the viability of applying beet juice efficacy, cost effectiveness, impact on the environment, etc. So beet juice, big question.
Yeah,
Katie, you wanna
beet
jump
juice
in?
is my favorite alternative just because it's so creative. But beet juice, I think Iowa was using beet juice for a while. But it's still out there as an option, but I don't think people are seriously considering it as much as acetates because it is beet juice, it's sticky, it's sweet, so it's going to attract animals to the road, which if we're trying to avoid car accidents is another problem. But then same as the issue with acetates is beet juice is organic. And so it does also have that high oxygen demand, and it's a little bit more concentrated than when you have calcium magnesium acetate, where you just have the acetate that's organic, or potassium acetate. So it does have a higher oxygen demand than some of the other alternatives we're looking at. And so for these reasons, it isn't as popular. And I believe it's also been combined with chlorides instead of having been used when you're thinking glycol, formates, acetates. You don't mix those with chlorides. And so, yeah, it's not as promising of an alternative, but it is really interesting. Yeah, I know same with molasses is kind of another food option that's been considered. But yeah, I know it's not being really looked into as like one of the best possible alternatives.
Mhm. I would add in there that beet heat is a proprietary product that, I mean, from the name, I'm assuming there's some beet juice in it. I believe it's then mixed with other chlorides, and that is sometimes an additive in different salt brines, or sometimes used maybe as an additive when communities are pre-wetting their salt. It looks like we've got another question here. This one, Bailey, might go to you. There's not a lot of background, but Craig is asking, should I be having my well tested for sodium chloride?
Well, that honestly probably depends on where you're located, as well as what kind of environment is around where your well is potentially. I don't know that I can tell you whether you should or should not have it tested, but I would say consider if you have roads nearby that are regularly applied with road salt, and maybe even look into your own state agency and what they use. And if they recommend having your well tested regularly, then maybe so, yes. But yeah, I think I'd probably need a little more background information to specifically answer that for you.
Yeah, and Craig, I would add that if you do live in Wisconsin, there are some resources out there for other people who have private wells. I'm assuming it sounds like you've got a private well. So I can share some information that is available through the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, and their well water viewer. Looks like we've got another question here from Ella. Is there any investigation into microbes with lower aerobic requirements to degrade these deicers, or finding optimal groups of microbes to stock in watersheds where the alternative deicers are used?
That's an interesting thought. I don't think that there is, because we're applying this deicer on the roads. It's ending up, everywhere in the environment. We aren't catching it all and could pass it through like one container full of these microbes. That is a very good idea, I think. But yeah, I think the way that road salt's applied and it just ends up in the environment is, there's so many different kinds of microorganisms out there in the water. And so there's probably some that, yeah, they have a metabolism that would maybe not use oxygen, but trying to add those to the environment would cause a whole lot of other problems to change the microbial communities out there. And so, yeah, we'd have to do it coming right off the road, which would be a whole nother big engineering project idea. But yeah, interesting thought.
All right. Next question for both of you. Have you seen research on whether brining is less corrosive than dry salt applications?
I can't specifically speak to the corrosiveness, but I know overall brining is much less environmentally harmful, uses less salt while still being effective. But yeah, I'm not specifically sure about the corrosive comparison of the two.
Yeah, my 2 cents there would be the idea is that with brining, we're able to use much less salt overall. And so the corrosivity is going down with the total reduction, overall reduction in salt use. All right, looks like we've got more questions here coming in. I know we're getting close to our 1 o'clock mark, but Wilf Nixon again has said, near Lake George in New York, they had a significant chloride issue, but reduced and found that the chloride levels in the lakes were reduced. In cases of chloride contamination, were best practices used? So I don't know, Bailey, if that is maybe in reference to the New York studies, like if you know anything about if they changed their management practices.
So I think that best, in terms of Lake George, that is a regular topic of discussion, and they've done quite a bit over there. That best management practices image that I had actually shown in my presentation is actually from a paper that one of the major scientists, Dr. Rick Vallier, as well as Dr. William Hentz, my advisor, worked on, and they both did work at Lake George together. So I would assume that that was probably a contributing factor to what you're referencing in terms of Lake George specifically, but I would have to do more research into the area as well. But yes, that is a direct image from those two scientists. So it would not surprise me at all if that was part of their major plan.
All right.
I can,
yes, Katie.
Yeah, I can jump in here, and I don't know about a specific case, but I know like that's one big objective is these alternative de-icers is that when we're following best practices and still seeing like really negative environmental impacts in sensitive waterways, that's the specific area you want to target for use of alternatives. Maybe instead of broadly, for example, for potassium acetate, up here in Duluth, Minnesota, we're on the edge of Lake Superior. So we really want to make sure we keep our waterways really healthy. Versus if you're thinking about a part of the state that maybe has a lot less water, it's not as big of a deal when you're applying chloride de-icers. So that's something we think about is in cases where there's a lot of places where really no level of salt is safe. And so you're applying it and it's ending up in your waterway, even if you're trying to minimize the amount you're using. And that's a really good place to go look at alternatives.
I would jump in there though, Katie, and say, you know, maybe there's not a lot of surface water, but we're still potentially salting then our groundwater, right? Our drinking water, which will be actually our talk tomorrow. So I know a few people are saying they have to jump off. I think if Katie and Bailey are able to stay on, looks like we might have a few more questions that have come in, but I just want to say thanks to everyone who does have to leave, and please do continue to spread the word about the week and today's webinar. It will be archived on our YouTube station channel, I guess. And then, yeah, all of our other talks this week will also be on YouTube starting at 12:30 Central Time. So let's see, another comment here from Wilf. He said, just a note on beet juice. It is not used on its own, but as an additive to salt brine. Typically between 30 to 5% by volume is beet juice. So, all right, then we have a question from Wendy. Assuming other organizations and agencies are doing research on alternatives, where is that data and can we build upon it? So other data about research on alternatives, what's out there? Where should people go?
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, there is a lot out there. Yeah. Over the past few decades, but when you're thinking about all of the research together, it is really very, very little compared to what we know about chlorides. If you're interested in alternatives, I would say just do a Google search, especially, you know, chloride alternative and then the name of a state specifically that you're looking at. For what's going on right now, so MnDOT is looking into potassium acetate. And yeah, other states are looking into de-icers or alternative de-icers. but it's not something where research is coming out like every year on new ones. And so it really is an area I know a lot of scientists are interested in talking about right now, but not something where we're seeing tons of research coming out. So yeah, if you're interested in alternatives, I would recommend just a Google search on alternatives in your state. And then every Department of Transportation says on their website what salts they're using. And so you could check that out too if you're interested to see what combination of salts are being used in different states.
Just to add to that too, there is quite a bit of readily available information too from things that are published in terms of data. I think people are kind of trying to be more open access to their data a lot of times. And so you can typically find like a subsequent, sorry, I can't think of the word, like an someone's data file or something like that, if you wanted to look at it as well, are often publicly shared. And in terms of alternatives, outside of just what Katie said, but someone asked about microbial stuff in beet juice earlier that she jumped on, but there is a more recent paper as well that says that those microbial communities can kind of break down some of that potentially change how that kind of releases certain things. And so I think that stuff's readily available as well. Google Scholar, any of that could kind of type in there.
Right. Thank you, Katie and Bailey. And, we're going to continue to have amazing young scientists like both of you, right? Continuing on. I know Katie is going to be moving out of her lab, but I think there's more work there, and Bailey's just getting started. So a lot of research. I would say also Clear Roads is an organization that a lot of DOTs are a part of. Maybe they all are. But that might be another good source for some information. And I could probably put something on Wisconsin Saltwise as well for some of our alternatives. All right, it looks like there's a question here from William. With all the parking and road in the Menominee watershed, how bad is our situation? I'm thinking that William might be talking about the Menominee River in the Milwaukee area. And I don't know, Katie and Bailey, if you have much to say on that.
Yeah, I'm not specifically familiar with salts contamination in Wisconsin. I don't know, Allison, you might know the most.
Yeah, I would direct William to probably Milwaukee Riverkeeper's website. They've been doing ongoing winter chloride monitoring for a number of years. We do have over 40 water bodies in Wisconsin that have now been deemed impaired by the DNR, and the majority of those are in southeastern Wisconsin, where it's the most heavily urbanized. So I would, look at Milwaukee Riverkeeper's site as well as the DNR's information, and I'm happy to provide you with some more resources as well if you really want to dig into what's going on in your community. We've got another question here. Potassium acetate application varies depending on road type, snowfall, and infrastructure type. Generally, for any snowfall event greater than 1 inch, an application of 30 to 50 gallons at 50% potassium acetate per lane mile is applied. So
that might be helping answer out the first question then of what the rate is.
Yeah. And I okay, yeah, so 35 to 50 gallons per lane mile. All right. And I think that takes us to the end of our questions for today. So thank you both so much. Amazing resources you both are. And I look forward to seeing where you both end up here. But yeah, if anybody has more additional questions for Katie or Bailey, you can direct them through me, or if you, I think that might be easiest right now. I was going to say you can put your contact information in the chat, but that's going to be a little difficult to get to. So thank you both again, and look forward to the rest of the week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.